And the Maritime Museum for having us here. My name's Nick Lewis and I work in the School of Environment at the University of Auckland. I'm also a member of the science leadership team of the Sustainable Seas National Science Challenge, who are involved in putting this talk on. The challenge is a 10-year research program involving 9 research organisations and multiple partnerships with iwi entities and stakeholders ranging from business to community organisations, local government and multiple central government agencies. It's charged with enhancing the utilisation of New Zealand's marine resources, and its vision, it will discharge this objective in relation to a vision which is to secure healthy marine ecosystems that provide value for every New Zealander. Today's talk aims to stimulate debate about the need to organise and perform our economic interactions with marine resources differently, how we might go about doing this, and what it might take to establish pathways that transition us to a more sustainable economic performance. The challenge of actually achieving this is probably far from news for most of the people in this room, and certainly for anyone involved in the sea change process. Our starting position is that this will need to happen in all our engagements with the oceans, from what we do on land that creates discharges and runoff into the oceans, to our use of oceans for recreation, and across all those sectors that use marine resources to produce monetary and non-monetary values. The talk today is in 2 parts, with a short video in between that features the efforts of one small to medium-sized enterprise that is very much leading the way in teaching us how to do this. In the first part of the talk, I'll introduce the concept of blue economy, which the challenge is using to organise research into more sustainable forms of marine economy. And I'll highlight some of the pressures driving the need for change, draw on some diverse examples to illustrate the breadth of the challenge of achieving this change, and point to a set of New Zealand-based initiatives that are beginning to show us the paths that we might take, leading up to the example of agri-sea. This will lead into the second half of the talk from Massey University's Dr. Jason Mika, who will highlight how Māori enterprises and communities are very much leading the way towards what we're terming a blue economy. How do I get these buttons right? Without wanting to point fingers or catastrophise, which I've learnt via the media is a word over recent days, there's no doubt that we have a poor record of damaging practice and weak environmental management globally, in the oceans, globally and locally. And there's no doubt that the ecological change has been significant, and the challenges posed by ecological degradation and environmental change are severe. You could fill a small library with reports, media coverage and academic papers on measures, warnings and predictions of just how bad that degradation has become in some parts of the world in particular. The Ministry for the Environment, I think, summed up where we're at quite nicely in 2016 in its top 5 issues: climate change, degradation of coastal habitats and ecosystems, pollution of marine environments, exploitable and unsustainable harvesting practices in terms of threatening marine birds, mammals, fish species and the benthos, and ecological risks associated with the intensification of use in coastal areas. And of course all these are interrelated. Climate change, of course, is the big driving force behind much of this stuff, and it's also doing a lot of the joining up of these kinds of effects, if you like. As the IPCC recently put it, there's no hiding from climate change, and we have 12 years to act to prevent certain tipping points that will see more disastrous outcomes, which translates into the minds of children at schools as we've got 12 years left on the planet, as I was told by my daughter the other day, to argue my way out of that particular hole. In the oceans, we're already experiencing increases in ocean temperatures, increased runoff from land, and ocean acidification that can be anchored home to climate change. And with these things declining, declining ocean productivity, shifts of species to higher latitudes, and damage to estuarine ecosystems. The science suggests that we can expect new ecological, biosecurity, environmental, disease uncertainties, and risks for aquaculture and fisheries. So we really need to act, and there's no point at this point blaming anyone for anything. And so in its latest framing, the MFE again points out that none of this is new. This is the state of the Environment Report for 2019 that's been with us, I think, now for a couple of months. MFE is again sounding the alarm bells at a national level, and in what scientists in my department have interpreted as a relatively measured way. I'm not a scientist. I can't tell you all about climate change and so on. I can only report what's being said. Again, MFE has used a key issues-based approach to outlining the state of New Zealand's environment. The coasts and oceans feature in 8 of the 9 national matters of concern that the Ministry identifies. These concerns include the ongoing impact of economic practice in the oceans, and perhaps even more dramatically, they point to the impact on the oceans of land-based activities, from agriculture and forestry to urban development, and of course the impacts of climate change on marine environments, and the effects on the climate of all economic activities. So there are things that we're doing at across our engagement with marine resources that are having impacts on climate change. So there are a set of practices that we can look to change in all sectors, not just in marine sectors. Oh, I'm going to do that. Even the World Economic Forum is expressing its concern, although it's also quick to point out that at the global level at least, the world is responding in some kinds of ways. It points to new management action, for example, in the form of a sharp increase in the establishment of marine protected areas and species conservation and anti-pollution initiatives. And it also points to the adoption by marine economy businesses of new green technologies. It highlights certain, what it claims to be decisive shifts in collaboration among agencies at national and global levels. These are largely environmental agencies. And it also points to what I'm going to talk about now, to a growing interest in the blue economy. So, what is this blue economy? How many people have heard this term? Yeah, it really is proliferating and sort of registered in a proliferation of conferences, research initiatives, reports from government agencies, international governance and conservation agencies, academics and industry. From the Arctic to the Mediterranean to Australia to the European Union to the United Nations to the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, and so on. So much of the new collaboration that the World Economic Forum suggests that we're experiencing is based on some interpretation or other of this notion of a blue economy. The issue, however, is that the term can have radically different meanings. And it can have radically different meanings in different settings, and it can be used to advance all manner of different forms of interest. These meanings vary from a rampant exploitation of the oceans as a new frontier for global capitalism to a call for more small-scale, community-centred economies in traditional fishing communities in heavily populated parts of the world. So this term is expected to do enormous amounts of work in the way that we think about the world, the way we format policy, and the way we act, particularly around our businesses. At core, though, I think we can identify from all of the uses of the term a set of propositions that we need to think through and to use to guide some of our practices. The first is that societies must look to the oceans to secure their food, energy, and wider economic futures as a source of resources. The oceans are maybe not a frontier to go and pillage, but they are a source of an important part of humanity's future. The second is that oceans offer enormous opportunities for economic development. So there are jobs to be had back on land, there are new industries to be built, new futures to be made. The third is that realising these opportunities will require a significant investment in science and technology. It will require effort to actually mobilise these resources in a particular way. And fourth, and perhaps the most contentious of these propositions, is that growth must involve a fundamental transition to ecologically and socially sustainable economic activities. We do not want to do to the seas, in any more than we already have done, what we've done to the land. We must do economy differently, including how we manage marine resources. So if you take a broader conception of economy, it's not just a set of activities conducted by firms, but to include regulatory and management interventions in the use, in the framing of resources, in investment in bringing them to be resources, and in the management of those resources, then we must include thinking about management and management of those resources. So in short then, enhanced utilisation of resources, which is the challenge's objective, cannot simply mean economic growth. And this just opens up a can of worms that I find myself swimming in. But it is an important point. How we do this is the crucial dimension. So a set of starting points then to begin to answer that question in the New Zealand context. What does our current marine economy look like before we start thinking about how do we green it to make it blue, if you like? I have a set of, and most of this kind of framing is probably familiar to people. We have coastal tourism, commercial fisheries, aquaculture and wild catch, offshore minerals, marine infrastructure, offshore, whoops, we've got offshore minerals twice, no. The government services involved around the oceans, utilising the oceans, managing, looking after the oceans and the things that happen on them. Blue biotechnology, the rise of the use of biotech technologies to develop new products out of the oceans, including mussel oils and fish skin masks for cosmetics, and applications for various applications of fish skins in medical technologies and so on. And green energy. But we also have potentially a whole set of partially, and we already have these in action, partially monetised resource uses. The amenity values that we attach to oceans when we build our coastal properties, for example, they're part of what might be called a blue economy. Recreational uses, when we go out onto the oceans to fish or to yacht, is that a verb? To sail and enjoy the oceans in particular ways. To the ecosystem services that oceans provide in terms of filtering some of the runoff and so forth, to activities that occur elsewhere. To a whole set of new, what I'm calling restoration economies, associated with green impact bonds and blue carbon and sort of various forms of government and community investment in restoring wetlands in particular and coastal areas. To a set of renewable passive and almost sort of derivative kinds of economies, other forms of government service, professional services, research and education. The National Science Challenge is part of a blue economy. So how do we count and think about this kinds of things? It's certainly part of a marine economy in the first instance. A set of more marketised services, customary uses and other forms of gathering, cultural and spiritual engagements with the oceans, and a series of non-use values that derive from actually not using the ocean for any particular thing, for bequeathing oceans to our sort of human-centred sense of the environment as being valuable for its own sake. And then, of course, there is the environment being valuable for its own sake. which often gets left out of these kinds of conversations. I'm not going to give you a whole suite of numbers, in part because that will expose me to all manner of critique and contentious debate and so on, in part because the point of this talk is not to walk away being able to say aquaculture and fisheries are worth $1.8 billion of exports. That's not what I seek to achieve in this kind of talk today. But we do have, employment is growing. We know that the total value of marine economy is growing across all of the sectors. We know that there's an increasing interest in biotech. And we know that these kinds of, the science associated with a marine economy, the interest in restoration economies, the interest in blue carbon, the interest in seaweed, the interest in ecosystem, coastal ecosystem restoration is increasing. I'm probably chewing up all my time, so I'm going to shoot on very quickly here. We can begin to think, though, that into a more blue economy frame. So if we start thinking about not in terms of simple sector terms or not in terms of just monetized and non-monetized economy, we might be thinking about ways in which we use the oceans as a set of targets to actually do some greening. So we might be thinking, okay, how can we grow green practices? How can we grow a blue economy, a different set of activities associated with sustainability from the centre out into all along these kinds of axes to different forms of practice. So thinking about coastal tourism, okay, we don't really want to drive coastal tourism per se, we want to drive ecotourism on the coasts. If we want to put money into R&D around wild catch fisheries or aquaculture, we should be thinking primarily of green investment, of green technologies that we're sinking our money into. And then you begin to perhaps build this notion of blue economy in the New Zealand context. And I'll come to what that might mean in the New Zealand context shortly. Actually right now. So we might actually be able to develop a definition then of blue economy in the New Zealand context, of where we might be thinking about putting management effort and where we might be wanting to put R&D expenditure into a set of activities that utilise ecologically and culturally appropriate technologies to create economic values from marine activities, reduce ecological risks and harms, and contribute directly to social, cultural and ecological well-being. This is not the deepest form of sustainability definition, but it is a long way from doing increasing growth but trying not to do much harm. So it's a kind of shift in position, if you like. And it won't happen by itself. Pathways towards a blue economy have to be opened and supported, drivers identified, potential value identified and highlighted, innovation encouraged, supportive soft and hard infrastructure developed, and supportive regulatory and decision-making settings put in place. And that's some of the work that we'll be attending to in the second phase of the challenge funding over the next 5 years. But there is a base to begin with, and this is what's kind of exciting in the New Zealand context. There are multiple small-scale initiatives in ecotourism. Dive to Tukaka, for example, puts a lot of effort into its operations. Whale watch, various forms of encounter with the mammals of the ocean. Are ecotourists in their basic, in their essential nature, but they're also developing a set of techniques and technologies to ensure that they minimise their impact on coastal environments. Marine circular economy, there's an outfit called Waikaitu in Nelson that actually takes Undaria off mussel lines and then turns it into fertilisers and other forms of green product for sale onshore and offshore. So these kinds of initiatives are in play. Blue biotech, Jason may mention a particular project that's working with bioactives around kina to develop new products there. Sustainable technologies in large-scale production, the precision seafood harvesting initiatives led by government, Sanford, Moana, New Zealand, and a few other kinds of partners. There's big drive now towards offshore aquaculture that I'm sure some people in the room know far more about than I do. Seaweed's on everybody's lips as a prospective product that can be done in a green way. New commitments to green certification programs. Many of the outfits now working in the marine economy are kind of greening themselves, if you like, through audit requirements and requirements imposed upon them in order to meet their green certification. We'll come back to Māori blue economy a little bit later. But there are also interests in carbon sequestration. The New Zealand Investment Fund has been thinking through those possibilities associated with seaweed. And there are other initiatives around the country thinking about how can we get into the blue carbon market. Just leave you with 2 or 3 kinds of examples from offshore. And I have to thank Nigel Bradley, who's in the audience, for putting me onto Urchinomics, which is an attempt to deal with kina barons by removing the kina, growing them, bringing them back to health and fertility in cages, and then utilising them as economic products. There's the A+ aquaculture commitment to auditing their practices and putting all the aquaculture practices through a green audit process, which demonstrates a range of commitments, I guess, to green sustainability. And of course, we've got seaweed that's very much the star of many of these kinds of activities. You probably can't see this very well, but I do commend you to go and look at greenwave.com.org. This is Bren Smith, who a couple of us from the Challenge had the pleasure of spending some time with in New Haven and going out and looking at his vertical farming and operation in Long Island Sound. And what you can see there is an attempt to establish a different form of ocean farming. Once a fisherman lost his boat and his livelihood to the collapse of the fish stocks off the northeast coast of the US, redoing what he's doing, his operation in a much more sustainable way. And he makes a number of claims. He claims that farming 5%, that this kind of activity could lead to farming across 5% of the US waters, that the protein would be equivalent to 5 trillion cheeseburgers, and that he could. None of this makes any sense to me. I can't imagine 1 trillion cheeseburgers, sequester 135 million tons of carbon and create 50 million jobs. So what it is a small-scale initiative that could be not necessarily scaled up into a single enterprise, but proliferated into multiple kinds of enterprises. And that's the sort of way of thinking, I think, that we need to develop. And my final slide here is, I think it's my final slide, is a look at a big firm who might be considered to be a champion of trying to do things differently within a corporate environment. And this is the Sanford's. This is the Sanford's annual report from last year. I have to declare here or disclose an interest. Volker Kunz from Sanford's is on our board, the Sustainable Seas board, but at the same time, I think what you can see in the devotion of so much of that annual report to what they call the 6 capitals, only one of which is financial, so human, manufactured, intellectual, natural, and a social relationship, which translates into a large chunk of the annual report and a set of really pivotal kinds of claims that demonstrate that industry and that big corporate partners are beginning to think about the challenge of building a blue economy from our current marine economy. So, one business that really is defining a new blue economy approach, you're going to have to move something for me, aren't you? Yes. One business that really is defining a blue economy approach to its enterprise is Agri-Sea. And I'll let the video describe this business for you. It's clearly a particular form of enterprise, so it's not that all enterprises should be constructed in this kind of way, but it gives us, I think, it's very much a champion of blue economy, but it also gives us a model for thinking about how we can do economy differently. So I have to click something, or will you click it for me? Okay, thank you, and after the little short video interlude,